this is the Provoked Prawn, and this little thing is the Gigabyte Aorus B650i Ultra. And in this video I'm going to show you how it's not only the size of a tiny squashy banana, but has a number of interesting highlights to it, and some things to bear in mind, including hot temperatures with the AMD Ryzen 7 7700X and some considerations there. But I'm going to kickstart this off by talking to you about all the different things that are interesting about this board, and there are a lot considering how tiny it is. I've built this in the Corsair 2000D Airflow if you want to see an ITX build, but despite its small stature, this is actually a really powerful board with lots of interesting highlights. For example, it can manage up to 3 PCIe NVMe SSDs. You can see it's got plenty of I/O on the back, and some interesting highlights. You'll see, for example, there's a lot of screws there because there's a fan on one of the NVMe drives to keep it cool. The box for this thing comes packed with all sorts of little things in various different bags. So I'm going to go through some of them and talk about the interesting highlights because there are a number of different ones. For example, there's an expansion card in here. This is a curiosity for me in an ITX motherboard. I've not seen this before. Essentially, it gives you expansion slots for various different things. You'll notice, for example, that it has SATA connections on it. So for these, for SSDs and hard disk drives, more on that in a little while. There's also a special cable specifically for your front panel connections for your case, so your reset switch, power LEDs and such. A cable dedicated to splitting USB connections. So you've got 2 USB connections on the motherboard. You can't plug USB directly into the motherboard, so that's a curiosity. Then you have some extender cables for sysfan headers. Sysfan headers are lacking on this one. I'll talk about that in a little while. And then you have an RGB extension cable, and then obviously the data cables for your SSDs and hard disk drives that you'll need to plug into that expansion card. So as standard, this is fairly interesting immediately. It also has a little Wi-Fi 6 antenna that screws into the back. Not unusual in itself, but you do need to account for this in your build, because for me this was a bit of a pain to plug in, but it's really going to depend on the case that you're using. Now, this thing is laid out with all the different things that I'm going to be using here. Looks like there's quite a lot going on, and it is pretty interesting. It is tiny, obviously being an ITX motherboard, but there's plenty of highlights here. Obviously 2 slots for DDR5 RAM, and it does support Expo as well, so it will work there. It's an AM5 motherboard, and I'm using a Ryzen 7 700X, as I already said. Now, the expansion card is an interesting highlight because you'll see there's no SATA ports on the motherboard as standard. So in order to use hard disk drives and SSDs, you need this little card. And that's interesting because you can choose not to use it. You'll notice there are other things as well. There is a system fan header connection on there, a front panel connection, and a 12-volt RGB header. This gives clues that you're going to need these additional cables for some of the things potentially in this build. So you might use this or you might not. It really depends on the setup. I didn't actually use it, which was an interesting experience, but it means that you can shed it and use other things. But if you do use it, let's say you're going to put a lot of system fans in your case, you're going to need this extension cable. So you're going to need to plug in that card and that system fan cable. If you have a multitude of front panel connections, you're also going to need this adapter. Now, this is an interesting adapter because it's quite large. As you can see, it goes from this tiny connection on this expansion card into a larger connector that then allows you to plug in a variety of connections. So if you've got reset switch, power switch, hard disk drive LEDs, power LEDs, and other things that you need to plug in, then you can use this. What I found was I didn't actually need to do it. If you ignore the power LED, you can just get the reset switch and power button directly on the motherboard, as I'll show you in a second. But if you have a single front panel connector on your case like this, you can slip that in quite easily, and you'll see that will line up on the left-hand side. But there's also all the other outputs that you'd find on a normal-sized motherboard, but they're just in this larger extension cable rather than directly on the motherboard. And that's the theme for a lot of the things on here. Basically, some of them have been shed from the motherboard itself onto either expansion cards or extra cables. But as I said, you don't have to use these. So you can see as an example here, I ditched the power LEDs, and the power switch and reset switch can be plugged directly into the motherboard, so I don't need to use the expansion card. You'll see the markings for RST1 and PW_BT1. That's power switch and reset switch. easy to plug in. So you can do that as an option, which is pretty interesting. So there's some flexibility in how you set it up depending on what you're doing with your build. So it's worth bearing in mind and knowing before you go into the build process. So hopefully this will help. And I'm going to cover a few different things like that of interest as you go through. So stick with me to the end, especially to see why a BIOS update is important for expo and for SoC voltage as well, because that's going to be important too. So the other thing I said is a lack of system fan headers as standard. So if you want to add in sort of standard fans like Noctua fans to your case, you'll need to use the expansion card and this cable to then access those. That was the one thing I didn't like, is it lacks fan headers directly on the motherboard. But if you're using an alternative, like for example the Corsair Commander Core XT that I've got here, and most of that's going to be through USB, then no worries, because you've got this USB extension cable which plugs into the bottom. Now again, you don't plug USB directly into the motherboard, you have to plug this cable in first and then the USB connections. Also, obviously we've only got one PCIe X16 slot on the bottom there where your GPU is going to go, so you do need to think about the cabling with this USB cable obviously sticking out, because where you're going to run that to and how you're going to get the USB connections to it, it's a consideration. We don't want to interfere with your graphics card obviously, so it's something to think about. Now, one of the biggest highlights of this board for me is the flexibility of the NVMe SSDs. So despite its small stature, it will take 3 NVMe SSDs, and one of them is PCIe Gen 5. So I'm using the Seagate FireCuda 540 in this video, but I'm also going to be using a Crucial P5 Plus, which is a Gen 4 drive, and showing how to install a WD Black SN850. Now, underneath the heatsink that you take off on top, obviously you'll naturally find the usual thermal pads and stickers, so you need to remove the stickers, and the thermal pads will help with cooling. But this top plate also has a fan in it to help cool that top drive. So the top slot, the slot that you can see now that I've just revealed, is a PCIe Gen 5 slot. So a Gen 5 drive will run there, and this drive will run up to 10,000 megabytes a second. I'll show you that in a minute. That's interesting because underneath there, as you'll see in a second, you can also install a Gen 4 drive on the other side, which will also run at the usual Gen 4 speeds. So really impressive. Now this is an expansion card, so there's yet another expansion card of sorts in here, because in order to access the Gen 4 drive, you have to tug it off the motherboard by unscrewing it and then pulling it out of there. And then you'll see underneath there's another NVMe port and more thermal pads. So you need to obviously remove the stickers and make sure there's good thermal contact amongst all of that. And when I say stickers, I mean the plastic covers on the thermal pads. I've done a video separately on whether you should take stickers off of your NVMe SSDs, and I'll link to that in the description, because the answer is you shouldn't, but many people do, and it doesn't seem to make much difference, so I wouldn't recommend it personally. But you can see we've got a slot here, and as I said, I'm going to install a Crucial P5 Plus on here. Now there's some interesting points, because you will notice there's an M2 screw on the Gen 4 slot, so you will need that tiny little screw. It is pre-installed on the motherboard, but extras are included, and you just need to slip your drive into there and then screw it back down with that tiny screw. I mention this because the Gen 5 slot, as you'll see in a second, actually has a Q latch, so a plastic latch which holds your drive in place instead, which makes life a little bit easier. But there's a sort of mix and match between them, so some of the drive bays have the M2 screw requirement and some don't, so the Gen 5 drive is a little easier to set up. So if you're only using one drive, pick this top slot, because it will be easy to install, and it's also the fastest on there. So this Gen 5 drive will set up and run at 10,000 megabytes per second, and I'm actually going to use this as my operating system drive as well, with other things on it, and I'm going to do a video separately on that, whether that's a good idea, because these drives are known to thermal throttle, so this would be an interesting experiment, I thought, in testing the performance of the motherboard, and also of the case, because a small compact form factor case naturally gets a little warmer. If this drive gets too hot, it will thermal throttle and it won't work as well. Now, that fan, the large heat sink, and hopefully the case cooling should ensure that that's not the case at all. And I'm actually going to show you some data in a little minute that confirms that it's actually pretty decent cooling in here as well. Now, this is going to vary from case to case, so you can't speak to everything, but this is my experience with it, is that it's easy to set up and pretty impressive, despite obviously what is essentially a tiny fan It's an interesting design and I really like it. It's very simple. So you can see the process for putting those drives in there and then just basically putting the expansion card back in, slotting it back into those clips, screwing it back down with the screws that you took out. Take care to make sure you know which order these screws come out, by the way, because they are different in size. So you need to make sure you don't put the wrong ones in. Now the other drive, as I mentioned, is the third drive slot. That's on the back of the motherboard. So you have to take off the back plates, the protective shielding on the rear. There's multiple screws, again, of different sizes. So make sure you're taking note of where you've screwed those in. And on the underside of that, you'll find there's another sticker and another thermal pad and another port. So this is, again, a Gen 4 NVMe SSD slot. So if you want to put 3 NVMe SSDs on this motherboard, you can, although this back one's probably not as optimal in terms of cooling or even access to it as the other ones, but it is possible. So there's plenty of what you can do here, which is pretty interesting, I think, frankly, on such a small board that it has that capabilities. Just don't forget to remove the sticker. And unfortunately, when I went to remove the sticker, the thermal pad came away with it. So I had to peel the thermal pad off and try to put it back again. So take care when doing that and putting it back over there, because the thermal pads and heat shields do make a big difference, as I showed in previous videos on the NVMe SSDs, especially the faster ones. You do want to make sure they're cooled well, because otherwise there will be problems. So just putting that cover back on and then screwing it all back down. So that's some of the initial setup of the motherboard, obviously, and what's possible, and a few things of interest immediately. So you can see it's pretty interesting in a number of ways. And there are continuing highlights as we go through the rest of it as well. So what I wanted to do was to test and make sure that those drives actually ran at the speeds that they should do. So I got hardware info 64 and I had a look at the Seagate drive, and you can see that the fire cooler is noted in there as having the PCI Express version 5, and it also has 4 lanes as it should do, which means it should run at the correct speed. While I was there, I also wanted to check and make sure that the Crucial P5 Plus was the same, or at least that it ticked the right boxes. And again, this is PCIe Gen 4 with NVMe lanes of 4 maximum. So again, that should run at its top speeds as well. It will be slower, but both are running at the expected speeds, which is surprising. Now, just to double check this, I ran some tests with Crystal Diskmark, and also at the same time I was running Cinebench, because I wanted to test the thermal performance of the case, the motherboard, and other things. And what you'll note is actually it was quite cool, about 69 degrees on that Seagate drive, which is actually really good considering the load it was under. And it ran at 9,999 megabytes a second or thereabouts, which is the speed you'd expect. Now, this is an AM5 motherboard, but it has AM4 bracketing on the top and bottom for your usual all-in-one cooler installation. You can remove it, as you've just seen me doing, because I'm using Corsair's iCue link system. It is a traditional sort of Intel setup, though, actually, with the pins on the motherboard. So the installing of the CPU, you have to be very careful and very gentle in how you put it in, so you don't bend those pins when doing so. But otherwise, nice straightforward installation and easy to do. Now, this board supports 2 sticks of DDR5. I'm using Corsair's Vengeance RAM in here, and it does support Expo. However, I will say that I would recommend updating the BIOS basically as soon as you set this up, because that will upgrade it to improve the stability of Expo on there to make sure that it actually runs faster. Now, USB-A front panel connection goes on the right hand side and USB-C in the bottom. I just want to show some of the connections as we go through, so you've got an idea of where things plug in, because you don't need the expansion cards for either of those. Once you're ready, obviously you can then pop the motherboard into the case, so into the 2000D airflow in this instance. Now, there are 2 power connectors on this that need to be connected up as well as all the other connections I've shown you. And so I'm using the Corsair SF1000L power supply unit. This is a 1000 watt modular PSU. Now, for this motherboard, the setup is really straightforward, because all you need is 2 connections, one 8-pin CPU power connector, one 24-pin. So the main power connector is this large 24-pin power connector that plugs into the PSU, and that has 2 connectors on the motherboard end. And this is a Type 5, by the way, power supply, so the connectors on the power supply unit are smaller smaller cables, so you can't plug it in the wrong way around than those on the motherboard. And you just connect those up, and then that will plug into the motherboard. Now, obviously, you do this when it's in the case. I just wanted to show it while I was outside the case, so you can see what that looks like and how it connects up. But you need to make sure that this is plugged in and seated well, otherwise the board won't power on properly. So just manipulate that into the right place and sort that out once it's all installed in there and ready to go. The other one is the 8-pin CPU power connector marked CPU in this power supply unit, and again, small end goes in the power supply unit and the other end goes in the top left. Now think about how much space you've got there, because also in the top left is the CPU fan header right next to that. I found both of those things difficult to plug in once the motherboard was in the case, and I actually ended up having to plug this 8-pin power supply cable for the CPU in to the motherboard and then put the motherboard in the case. So just something to bear in mind, because I had to basically take the motherboard out 3 times in order to access all these things. But those are the connections you need for power. So when I first turned the system on, there was alarming warnings of high temperatures. You can see we've got up to 103 degrees C and 97 degrees on the package of the CPU as well. Alarming considering that the CPU was barely under use, only at 38%. Now I figured this might well be down to thermal paste AIO issues, so I sorted that out. But then the next step was to do a BIOS update. And I've done a video separately on this and how to do it, if you want to see that, but I'd highly recommend doing it if you've got this motherboard or are planning on buying it, because my motherboard version was massively out of date. It was version F1 and the current version is F9C. Now there are a number of things in here with previous BIOS updates, including the SoC voltage change to ensure it only goes up to a maximum 1.3 volts. This has been a problem in the past with the Zeus motherboards, where some CPUs have been fried, so that's well worth updating the system. But it will also ensure better support for AMD Expo as well, so update that BIOS. And that is one of the first things that I did, because I wanted to make sure those temperatures went down, because that was pretty alarming. I wasn't even doing heavy testing at that point. I was just installing games and other things. So I'd highly recommend doing this. Now, the BIOS update process does take quite a time, and as I said, I've covered this separately if you want to find out how to do it. But it is fairly straightforward with Gigabyte's Q Flash, which is directly in the BIOS. There's an option to do it. There's also a button on the back of the motherboard, but basically you just need to go into the BIOS with the right file on a USB stick, and then you can go about doing this update. So then I went back into Windows and I ran some tests. I was running Cinebench R23 and some other tests because I wanted to see what happened under load, whether this had worked. What you'll see is the temps are still really high. I've got hardware monitor and hardware info open here, and Corsair's iCue software, just so I made sure the readings were correct. There are high CPU temperatures. Now, I do want to say that AMD's Ryzen CPUs actually run up to 95 degrees, so don't be alarmed if you do see this, because they actually throttle up to that point so that they can get maximum performance. Anything above that, though, should be concerning, but I wasn't actually too phased by this 95 degrees. Is actually okay, and we're putting it under a lot of stress here with Cinebench, so it's not the same. What we do want to look out for, though, is the CPU V-Core SoC voltage. You can see that every reading here says it's 1.284, so it's not over 1.3, which was that worrying area, and both Hardware Info 64 and Hardware Monitor both said the same, about 1.2. So worth checking with those. Are free downloads and it's easy to do. And then back into the BIOS, and we can enable XMP now and have a bit more solid performance out of that, out of your RAM as well. Now, you can also go into the tweaker settings. If you're concerned about the SoC voltage because you're worried about your CPU, you'll see that you can go in there, and then under there there's a V-Core SoC automatic setting. You can go in there and you can actually manually set your voltage in here. So if you are concerned that the motherboard's going to cause issues, it is possible to do it. And you'll see if you go through the list of manual voltages, you can only actually go up to 1.3 as the maximum anyway. The problem area with Zeus motherboards was they went up to 1.4 and over, and they got into trouble for it. So Gigabyte aren't necessarily in that same hot water, but if you are concerned about it, or if you do see similar issues to me, then maybe you want to play around with these things. And hopefully optimize it. But generally speaking, from what I've seen, this has been a great board with, as you can see, some pretty interesting features. If you want to check out the full guide to the 2000D and find out how I got on with that, please check the links in the description. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks very much for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed it.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.